Hi again, everyone. As many of you are aware, federal agriculture policy and budget decisions play a central role in shaping the future of farming and rural economies. This afternoon, we have David Grahn and Emma Jagaz here to explore the federal agricultural appropriations and budget process and the effects of recent USDA agricultural budget decisions that those decisions have had on producers and grant programs. David has recently retired as General Counsel of the Farm Credit Administration and is now a lecturer in the University of Arkansas Law School LLM in Food and Agricultural Law program. Emma is a first-generation organic vegetable farmer and owner of Moon Valley Farms. With that, I am going to turn it over to David to give us the foundation.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Let me try this. Can everybody hear me? No. Okay. We'll go back to this. Okay. Yes, I'm David Grahn. I recently retired, as Sam said, from the Farm Credit Administration, which is the bank regulator for the farm credit system. But in addition, I spent about 33 years at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, mostly in the Office of General Counsel, and my last position was Principal Deputy General Counsel. So I had the entire USDA, and I was the acting General Counsel at the beginning of the Biden administration. But I was also a career employee that was responsible for about half the missionaries at USDA. So I dealt with SNAP, commodity programs, rural development, crop insurance, and trade. So it was a pretty big portfolio. What I'd like to talk about today, if somebody wanted to talk about federal budget and how it works at USDA. Normally, when I teach this, it's a 3-day course, and it's 13 hours. I'm going to try to see if I can consolidate this down to the kind of bare essence, and also focus on some things that might be a little bit more current in terms of what you're reading in the papers. The first thing I want to talk about is the basic financing of the programs and how that works. I want to talk a few minutes about the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is a really interesting organization and that is very useful for secretaries of agriculture and can have a huge impact on U.S. agriculture in a very quick period of time. And the third thing I want to talk a little bit about is SNAP. What's been going on with SNAP and why it's been such a challenge the last month or so because of the shutdown. I want to do this and still allow about 10 minutes for questions, because I imagine there might be a few. So let's start with, how does the federal budget system work for USDA? The way I like to think about it is two big pieces, especially as it applies to agriculture. First is what people affectionately refer to as the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is Congress's attempt every 5-ish years, we're a couple of years behind in terms of this cycle, that does a comprehensive look at most, if not all, the vast majority of USDA's agricultural operations. There's a few pieces of USDA that are not covered in the Farm Bill. That generally doesn't cover housing, and it generally doesn't cover the child nutrition programs, and it generally doesn't cover that much about Forest Service. And the reason for that is those are outside the jurisdiction, the combined jurisdiction of the House and Senate Agriculture Committees. And that's where the Farm Bill originates. The Farm Bill has two general large blocks of programs. It has programs that are referred to as mandatorily funded programs and programs that are discretionarily funded. What a mandatory funded program simply means is that the authorization of the program and its funding happen at the same time. The discretionary funded programs are those programs where the funding is not provided for with the authorization, and the Farm Bill has both. So an example of a mandatory program would be the commodity programs, Title I, and most of the conservation programs in Title II. Those programs are funded, and the funding is provided for in the Farm Bill through the Commodity Credit Corporation, which I'll talk about in a minute. In terms of the discretionary funded programs, How many are familiar with the farm loan programs at FSA? Those are all discretionary funded programs. And their money does not come from the Agriculture Committee, it comes from the Appropriations Committee. SNAP is kind of a funky program. On the one hand, it is treated for budget purposes as a mandatory, but its funding, which would mean normally that it shouldn't have been covered by the shutdown, because the shutdown only covers discretionary appropriated programs. However, SNAP is what is referred to as an appropriated mandatory. That means that the funding is actually set in the appropriations bill every year, even though it is treated for budget purposes as a mandatory program. So one of the things I always ask my students is, do they think that SNAP is an entitlement? And they almost always say yes. They think it's just like Social Security, it's just like Medicare, that it's a mandatory program, and that an entitlement, which means it can spend whatever it spends. That is not correct. SNAP is, and I'll talk more about this when I get into SNAP, but SNAP has a cap. And we are learning about that cap right now because the appropriation didn't happen, and therefore SNAP all of a sudden stopped running. And that's because it is not an entitlement like Social Security. Social Security benefits are still going out. My retirement check is still going out. But SNAP benefits are not. And that's because of the way it's funded. And I'll get to the details of that when I talk about the SNAP piece. So you've got mandatory programs where the funding rides with the authorization, and you've got discretionary programs that are funded by the Appropriations Committee. To give you an idea of the relationship between the two, USDA runs 150, 170 billion, depending upon how things are going with SNAP, maybe 140 billion. About 23 of that or 24 of that's discretionary. Everything else is mandatory. So the mandatory side of the house is much, much bigger. Okay, so that's how the basics of how the programs are funded. Let me talk a minute about the Commodity Credit Corporation. The Commodity Credit Corporation is primarily a funding mechanism. It is an agency. It's technically a government-controlled corporation. It was established initially back in the 1930s as a Delaware corporation. But in the 1940s, when the Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act was enacted, it became a federal corporation. It became a government corporation, a government-controlled corporation. It doesn't have any employees. It operates through the various agencies of the Department of Agriculture. You would probably see the most through the Farm Service Agency. But also there are some NRCS programs that are run with USDA or what CCC funding. CCC has a $30 billion borrowing authority with the Treasury. That's how it's funded. What does that mean? That means that think of it like a home equity line of credit. CCC has a $30 billion home equity line of credit with the Department of the Treasury. And so how is that $30 billion measured? It's not dollars. So it's not like an appropriation where you have a fixed pot of money and then they burn through that pot of money. It is a $30 billion limit on something called net realized losses. So what is a net realized loss? Normally in federal expenditures you have obligations where the government has agreed to make a payment of some kind to somebody under certain conditions, or you have an expenditure or an outlay where the money actually goes out the door. So you could have an obligation for a loan that says, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to close this loan if you provide me with the rights of way and the other conditions necessary for the loan to be successful. That's an obligation. When I actually close the loan and start handing you money, that's an outlay. Net realized loss is neither. It's more accurately a mix. To have a net realized loss, CCC has to have an expenditure of dollars, so not an obligation, an expenditure of dollars, and there can't be any ability for the corporation to collect to reduce that amount of the expenditure. So think of a loan. When CCC does do loans, it does Farm Facility Loan Program, when it makes the loan and it expends dollars, in most federal loan programs, that's called an expenditure. And it is for CCC as well. But it's not a net realized loss because the expectation is the loan's going to get paid back. So only when the loan is closed and done and there is still a loss associated with that loan, does that become a net realized loss. So every year, CCC gets its credit card, its line of credit recharged. Most people think that that's done through the Appropriations Act, and there is a provision in the Appropriations Act that does that. But if you take a look at the Appropriations Act, its provision itself, it says it is done in accordance with 15 USC 713 bump A-11. And that is a 1961 law that provides a mandatory appropriation to cover the net realized losses of the corporation once the corporation knows what its net realized losses are for the fiscal year. So the question is, and this gets to what happened with soybeans. We had this thing about soybean payments. And all of a sudden, the secretary set aside $13 billion. Well, where did $13 billion come from? It came from the Commodity Credit Corporation. Now, the timing of when that came is really important because that net realized loss for the government's, for the corporation and for the agency's perspective would be better to have happened in 2025 than in 2026 fiscal year. Why do you think that might be? Why would we have cared which fiscal year to take the $13 billion from? Cash flow. See, what is, and I appreciated one of the earlier presenters talking about what is commonly referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, because it doesn't have a short title. The provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act increased reference prices. Now, those reference prices come out of Title I of the Farm Bill. Title I is paid for by the Commodity Credit Corporation. And it has, and a payment to a farmer is a net realized loss at the time of payment because there's no expectation it's going to come back, right? So there was going to be this increase in payments coming, and if they pulled $13 billion out of the $30 billion in 2026, that could have created a real cash flow problem for the department come next year. So they had to take it out of last year's money, and there was room. Now, the question is, when did they recharge it? Now, I don't know if anybody's been following what's been going on, but apparently we do have a deal on the CR, the continuing resolution. It hasn't passed yet, but it looks like it's cleared the Senate. It's probably going to clear the House. In addition, there are going to be 3 appropriations bills that are going to go with it. It's not just a clean CR. One of those appropriations bills is the Ag Appropriations Bill. So there will be the provision to recharge the net realized losses there. But frankly, under 15 USC 713 bump A-11, they probably could have recharged the credit card sometime in October. So there were, I don't know if you guys get Hagstrom or you know who Hagstrom is. He's somebody who does ag news around, one of the ag pundits. He talked about a conversation that Senator Hoeven had in mid-October where he said he talked to the department and everything was going to get paid and everything was going to be fine. And the reason is they took the 13 out of 2025. They could recharge the credit card before they had to put out the payments because they didn't put out payments during the shutdown for CRP and for the commodity programs. This fall, they had room. So the timing of those net realized loss calculations was drop dead critical. So let's think about CCC. Let me talk a little bit about CCC a little bit more, and then I'll go to SNAP. There's 3 ways that CCC funds programs. One way is that they get the funds, facilities, and authorities of CCC. In that Charter Act, in addition to having this bank account, $30 billion credit line with the Treasury, it also has a bunch of general authorities. It can contract for itself, it can sue or be sued, and it can settle its own claims. Now, the settle its own claims part is really important because most federal agencies don't get to do that. If a claim is above $250,000, they got to go to the Department of Justice, not the CCC. I've personally done settlements on behalf of CCC for over $1 million and delivered the check myself. I did not talk to the Department of Justice because CCC has the authority to settle its own claims. So when it has funds, facilities, and authorities in its authorization for use of CCC, it gets to use all those magic authorities that cut through a lot of red tape that normal federal agency have to deal with. So the second kind of CCC program is, by the way, Title I of the Farm Bill, the commodity programs, that's funds, facilities, and authorities of CCC. So that's how they get their regulations out so quickly. There's all kinds of bypasses that they get to do because of that. The conservation programs get the funding of CCC. Many of the rural development programs get the funding of CCC, but they don't get the facilities and authorities part, so they just get the money. It's treated as a mandatory appropriation that provides money with the authorization itself. And then there's a third kind of program, and that's something that, does anybody know about climate smart commodities? Anybody heard about that? Yeah, okay. Climate Smart Commodities was a program that was created entirely by the Department of Agriculture without any congressional support. And it was done under the specific authorities of CCC. Section 5 of the CCC Charter Act provides a series of specific authorities. I could go through the whole list, but in a nutshell, it is this. CCC funds can be used to create a program that provides support for the production, marketing, distribution, or the processing of agricultural commodities. So what initially Climate Smart was going to be a conservation program, but some lawyer suggested that CCC doesn't have the authority to create a conservation program. But what it does have the authority to do is to create a program that helps the marketing of agricultural products. Hence, Climate Smart marketing, the Climate Smart program was a program designed to essentially see if they could create a market for agricultural commodities that were produced in what was determined to be a climate smart manner. It's kind of like organic. And that was allowed to be used under CCC's authority, and billions of dollars went through that program. Okay, I've just got a couple more minutes before questions. When you get to SNAP, here's what happened. Because SNAP, it's a mandatory, but it needs an appropriation to set the number. And you might wonder why. If it's a mandatory, why did the appropriators appropriate the number? Well, the reason is the appropriators want this. SNAP is the largest account at USDA, and there is no way that the appropriators do not want to have some control or some influence over that program. So they appropriate the dollar amount. And the way the authorizing statute is set up is that that's allowed. If that number is breached, Section 18 of the Food Nutrition Act of 2008 specifically has a protocol that the Secretary is to follow to notify Congress and the public that SNAP is going to run out of money, and it gives the Secretary the authority to adjust benefits in order to make it underneath the caps. Now, back in, I think it was 2011, we had this little shutdown problem that happened again, kind of like this, right on top of the fiscal year. And there wasn't a contingency fund. There was just SNAP. And so what happened is that we were able to interpret a provision in what was then the Recovery Act that extended SNAP benefits up to 115% of their benefit levels because it was part of the recovery from the Great Recession. And that ran out in that October. And so we used that funding to pay the October payments, and then we got the CR during the month of October, and then we could drive on. But it put enough concern in everybody's pocket that maybe there needs to be some kind of contingency fund. So the appropriators set up a series of $2-3 billion accounts that are 2 years each, every year, to create a $6 billion contingency fund. Back when that was set up, that represented about a month's worth of SNAP. Problem is, the contingency fund got to be about the same, but the monthly burn rate for SNAP went up. And the way that SNAP is funded, it's very, very hard to fund it without going through you either fund the entire month or you don't fund it at all. If you try to fund it partially, you have to do a whole lot of reprogramming, not at USDA, but in the 51 states that administer it, because SNAP is not a USDA administered program at the ground level. So that's why this was causing all kinds of consternations about how to fund this. There is some authority for the department to move money around, but that is limited, and it probably wouldn't be enough to cover the shortfall. Hopefully now we can just get the funding bill passed, and we can then put SNAP back on its regular cycle. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I know that was a lot of information in a very short period of time. Sir.
Just one program you just touched on, rural development. Seeing when EPA talked about going back to clean water programs and giving it to, rolling it down to the states level, do you think rural development, some of those programs like water and sewer, are going to roll? They're going to roll back to the state, maybe to the state level, and let the state fund that, those kind of things?
Well, there have been discussions about either moving some of those programs out to, say, out of USDA to, say, EPA, or to move them out to the states. The struggle that, and I think the reason why that hasn't happened is because when EPA or the states do something on running these programs, well, the struggle is this. USDA has a field structure that gets into each of these rural communities. EPA doesn't have that. Some of the states don't even have that. And so I think there's been a lot of interest in wanting to keep those programs at USDA to take advantage of its field structure. Also, if you give it to the states, what you lose is the ability to leverage. Because rural development has a lot of cool programs, and they work best when they can work together. And if you can go to one area office and get information about all those programs and develop a plan for your community, because why are you putting in the water system? Well, you might be putting in the water system or because you want to upgrade the fire station, because to upgrade the fire station, that's necessary for this building development project that's going to be done outside of town, because the insurance company won't insure the project unless there is sufficient water and fire suppression in the community. And so the advantage you have with USDA is that you can go into one office and you can talk about having all that done in one go and have a plan. Whereas if you break it up to the states, that might be harder to do. And I think that's why eventually, and it's not just this administration, I've been doing this for 40 years. There have been successive administrations that have talked about these kinds of changes. And then when they come around to figuring out how retail USDA is and how integrated those programs can be if they're done right, that they begin to see why this makes sense in the way it's currently structured. Does that help? Yep. Okay. By the way, the other advantage having these local offices is that those local offices have contacts with the states, and that they are able to leverage what state programs are available as well. So they are a resource for both the federal programs and for the state programs that can comply, and other federal programs that might, because EPA might have something, and USDA probably has a better way to get to EPA than the community going directly. Other questions?
What would it take to increase the borrowing power of the CCC?
Wow. There have been talk about taking it to, because that's a really good question, because CCC's borrowing authority has not been raised, I believe, since about 1987, if I'm not mistaken. What it would take would be an offset. One people have talked about wanting to increase the borrowing authority to $60 billion, which would actually be on par with what it was if you take into account inflation back in the 1980s. The problem is they would need an offset. And that would be a massive offset, because CBO would score that for budget purposes at $60 billion a year over 10. So that would be $600 billion that they would need to find in offsets or money in the budget bill. And that's the problem, because of to me, the big block for moving that up, which I would think would make a lot of sense, is that you'd have to pay for it under the budget rules of the Congress, and that's the struggle. Other questions? Okay, well, let me just take the opportunity. This is the first time I've been to this conference. This is awesome. I just came back from Scottsdale. I know some of you were there as well at the American Agricultural Law Association. I think it's awesome that you guys are getting together, and I think the level of conversation about what's happening here is just really exciting. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to have a very different sort of presentation than my colleague here. I am a layperson's perspective as a first-generation self-taught farmer, and my interaction with federal grant programs. But I do want to start with a little bit of context. I know many of you in the room, and I also don't know a lot of you yet. So I started Moon Valley Farm. It's an organic vegetable operation back in 2012 on borrowed lands in the suburbs of Baltimore. For 8 years, I bartered for the use of land before I was able to cobble up enough savings from my modest farming salary to buy land of my own, thanks to a federal program under the FSA. Today, I farm on 70 acres. We're a certified organic and a GAP certified year-round farm and food hub. So we are collaborating with, coordinating with, and aggregating from over 50 other farmers in the region to strengthen and diversify our offerings in all 4 seasons. Our sales channels include a year-round community-supported agriculture program in which we're feeding over 1,300 members, an online farmers market for home delivery. We sell to over 100 restaurants, some of the best restaurants in the entire world, in DC and Northern Virginia and all throughout Maryland. We serve school systems. So we have been, all of this, what Secretary Addix was saying, is a lot of what I deal with on the day-to-day in terms of sourcing, processing, storing, and delivering to school systems and warehouses in 12 different counties across Maryland. And that's public schools. We also sell to private schools. And then finally, we also collaborate with nonprofits and universities and hospitals on food as medicine programs. So I have a pretty diversified farm in terms of our what products we're selling. We're selling hundreds of different products across over 50 farms. And we also have a diverse amount of sales channels. Now, I'm telling you that because as a first-generation farmer, I didn't start with all of this infrastructure and capacity and ability. In fact, I leveraged a lot of federal programs and grant programs, as well as loan programs to get us there. And I've seen actually several of the helpers in the room today. So one thing that I want to talk about before I really dive into some of these federal programs is why farmers like me will use federal programs and what we're using it for. I feel like there's a misconception about who uses federal programs and why. Well, farms like me use federal programs for a lot of different reasons, and one is just to accelerate our goals. So I have some, fast track some of our goals. For the first 8 years, I didn't do any grant programs. I actually didn't even take a loan until the first 4 years, I think, maybe 5. So I was very much just reinvesting the profits back into my farm. I was taking no salary or a very modest one in order to do that. But I'm a parent, I need some money too, and some of these programs really offer some of the support that farmers need to get to their goals faster. The Frederick County Ag Innovation Grant is one of those programs that really helped us to build out some of the infrastructure on my new farm when I bought it. And it really helped, it probably gave me 3 years ahead. It was something that I wouldn't have been able to afford for another 3 years. Marbidco's local aggregation grant, man, they accelerated us, I don't know how many years. I can't even, thank you. And that grant it is the reason that we're selling to school systems today. It is why we have the infrastructure and the contacts that we needed in order to diversify our sales channels for not only my farm, but all of the farms that we're working with. So it's given the opportunity to dozens of farmers to have the opportunity to sell to institutions. And so the Organic Market Development Grant, it helped us to offset the risk of diversifying our production further into grain and beans on the small scale. Some of the reasons that farmers go into federal programming is to accelerate social and environmental conditions as well. We've leveraged NRCS programs to install wildflower meadows and cover crops and windbreaks, as well as irrigation. And we're in the middle of a farm labor stabilization and protection program grant to help us improve H-2A worker condition on our farm by giving bonuses, by offering additional paid time off, by really helping to facilitate their right to organize. And importantly, as a first-generation farmer, a lot of these grant programs also help us help other farmers. So I am here today because of the generous help and support of a lot of farmers that came before me and that live, that are in the landscape. And a lot of these programs will help especially veteran farmers, beginner farmers, and socially disadvantaged farmers. So one of the projects that we're working on right now is a farmer market promotion program grant under the AMS, the Ag Marketing Service. Yes. And that one is helping us to grow our food hub strategically by partnering with socially disadvantaged farmers. You might imagine it's more profitable to collaborate with farmers who have generational wealth and can inherently, and this isn't true across the board, but a lot of these farmers who have been established for, a really long time are able to offer higher, just lower prices on their products because they've already had a lot of these infrastructure costs paid for. So this project is specifically helping us do that. And I'm also working with a couple of programs that help me to help new organic farmers learn how to go through this 3-year transition profitably. So as you might imagine, someone who has just name-dropped maybe half a dozen federal programs, we're involved in probably another half a dozen on top of that. This past year with a lot of federal changes has been stressful to say the least and fettered with uncertainty. Uncertainty might seem like an emotional state that you can sort of dismiss as, anxiety or something, but it's caused concrete financial disruption as well. And that's been a challenge for us on the ground as, we move typically very fast as farmers. So, for example, earlier this spring, the local Food for Schools contract was canceled for and this is nationwide. This was canceled with the local food purchase agreement program as well. And that's funding that the federal government was putting into both schools and food banks. And so the funding goes directly to those programs. So farmers don't directly get those funds, but we do indirectly compete for contracts in order to serve those programs. For the state of Maryland, the local Food for Schools program had about a little over $3 million up through the 2024 fiscal year, and for 25 through 8, because of the success of the program, they had been awarded over $8 million for this program. So farmers like me, who had been for years investing in programs such as Marbidco's to really invest in the infrastructure that we need to really scale for reaching institutional buyers such as the schools, we're now left without a certain path for how those buyers are going to find the funds to buy from local farms. We're also facing a disruption of reimbursement, and this has started and stopped throughout the year as the federal, just the funding freeze that started in January for many programs, and that was sustained for several months. And luckily, with the exception of the local Food for Schools program, we came out unscathed or uncanceled. So our programs were reinstated. They're now, since the government shutdown, has been in another state of disruption. But further than that, in the middle, so between the funding freezes, there's been a lot of disruption in terms of the program staff. So when we go to submit a reimbursement, or when we go to inquire about the status of the program or make a budget change, it often doesn't seem like there's anyone on the other side of the desk to answer those questions or to make those changes for us. So we've submitted reimbursement requests in July that have not been honored yet, and we're uncertain if they're going to be. Should we continue the program? I'm a woman of my word, and I signed a contract that I was going to do this program, so I have been doing it, and they all have these ongoing incurred expenses that we are promised reimbursement on, and when it doesn't happen, it's disturbing our cash flow. And as farmers, cash flow reliability is extremely important as we have really big spending months and really big, or seasons and really big buying ones. So yeah, that's just a few ways that we have been disturbed. We have been waiting for a long time on a bunch of answers. I have a lot of hope, and I think as a farmer, that's just my defective state of being, is a sort of hope monger. That's why we continue planting seeds every season. I am hopeful that programs will come back online, and that some, if not all, of my reimbursement requests will be honored, because I believe in our system and our country. And at the same time, it's been a hard time. So. I am happy to take any questions on that. Yeah.
Could you comment a little bit about you mentioned something about H-2A workers.
Mm-hmm.
How has that been impacted in this past few months, if at all?
Just the program in general, or?
Yeah, for you. I mean, how, in terms of being able to hire and retain, utilize people? Because I'm finding myself and all the farmers I know in Southern Maryland, labor is the biggest problem. We're hindered because we don't have good, adequate labor.
Yeah, so we have, on my farm, 10 H2A workers, and most of them are returning workers, although we had some additional need this year. And for the most part, the impact has been that, honestly, they're a bit scared just to be Hispanic in the United States today. They are here totally legally. We do everything above the board. They have all of their papers, and it's still a, you see a lot of these stories with ICE, with detention, with people just being detained, even if they have papers or are here legally. So there's been some fear. As far as our actual interaction with the program, we already had all of our employees here. We start our season pretty early in March, and so several of the workers came over in March, and then several more in May. And the program itself has been fine. They did remove the fees for farmers to apply to the program, which felt a little offensive because it was after most of us who normally employ the program have already spent the funds. But other than that, it's been okay. I heard that there's a period of this past 6 weeks where you couldn't apply. But most of us are already with workers or at the end of their season. Any other thoughts, questions for either of us?
I'm going to go ahead and ask one of our pre-prepared questions, and while people think of others that they might have. Thank you so much, Emma and Professor Grahn, for sharing, walking us through the basics of the congressional process for appropriations for USDA and the funding mechanisms there, and then Emma about the impacts that your farm has experienced with the uncertainties. I think I would like to ask the question, if it's okay, about the litigation, the multi-state litigation against USDA, and the basis of the USDA sort of pulling back some funding for different programs due to or based on a change in their policy or their priorities. So just curious if you could comment potentially on, is that likely to prevail? I heard, some things about what's detrimental reliance on these contracts, and whether that would be enough to overcome USDA's position, and the difference between being awarded versus an obligation of these funds for these USDA grant programs. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Let me take a swing at that. Let me start by saying that you used a lot of words there that are really, really critically important, and I'd like to break down the question a little bit. First, we have in the federal world, we have grant programs, we have contracts, and we have cooperative agreements. For the most part, what I'm hearing is that the programs affected are either cooperative agreements or grants. You also talked about obligations versus expenditures and detrimental reliance. Let me try to put all that together. The Supreme Court took a swing at this in a very small order that they issued, and it was issued by Justice Barrett in a case involving the National Institute of Health's grants programs that were in a similar position than a lot of the programs that are at USDA. And what the justice suggested is a couple of things. First, that for the purposes of this review, they were treating grants like contracts, which from a legal perspective is an interesting thing, because there is a statute called the Federal Grants and Cooperative Agreements Act, and there is a very distinct distinction between a grant and a contract. A grant is a payment without consideration where somebody is providing some kind of activity that is in the public interest. There isn't consideration between the two parties. In a contract, you have a consideration between the two parties. If in the contract world, the federal government can terminate a contract for cause, without cause. It's called termination for the convenience of the government. And it's in the federal acquisition regs. It's a standard clause in the contract. It varies a little bit in terms of how exactly it's written and what the exact terms are. But the punchline is that if the government decides one day to wake up one morning and say, we don't want your contract anymore, they can cancel it. However, if they do that, they are responsible for what's referred to as reliance damages. That means if you took steps in that contract to hire people, to purchase goods and services, to prepare yourself to be able to be in compliance with the contract, the government's got to pay for that, in a nutshell. There's a lot of case law that goes into detail as to how that all gets done, but that's the 50,000-foot view of how the world works. Grants are not in the same category. They are not covered by contract law, generally. They are covered by a regulation issued by the Office of Management and Budget called 2 CFR Part 200, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And specifically, there is a provision, I think this is the right site, it's 200.340A, that talks about termination. And specifically, I think it's paragraph 4 that talks about termination of grants because there has been a change in policy. And so the question then becomes, okay, if you're going to challenge that, how does that work? In the contract world, it's easy. You go and you file a claim against the contracting officer, and if that doesn't work, you go into the federal court of claims and you hash it out there, or you go through some kind of other administrative process before you go into court and you ask for money damages against the United States. But in a grant, you're actually doing two things. First, you're saying you didn't have the right to do that because it's arguably you're going to say it was arbitrary and capricious. Well, that's an Administrative Procedure Act argument. Then you're going to say, I want my grant back. That's not reliance damages, that's the actual grant. And so what the justice seemed to suggest is that you actually have two separate causes of action that you have to pursue, and you can't pursue them at the same time. You would have to get a determination under the APA that the agency's actions of terminating the grant were arbitrary and capricious, but that doesn't get you money. That just gets you a determination. Then you'd have to take it down the road to the Court of Federal Claims and make a claim against that. Now, mind you, this was in an emergency order issued by the Supreme Court that's probably 3 pages long. It wasn't on the merits of the case. It's on their emergency docket. And it's only Justice Barrett. The whole issue on the emergency docket was whether or not they were going to agree to impose a stay on the order that said that the grants were improperly terminated. So we have a bit of a legal mess that's going to have to get sorted out. But potentially, you're talking about a situation where you've got two separate causes of action involving a grant. Now, let me just throw one little, if I've got a minute. Do I have a minute? Yeah, okay. Let me suggest a little twist that I was talking to some people ahead of this presentation today. And it occurred to me, when the government obligates funds, that's a legal thing. What that means is the federal government agency has determined that it has a legal obligation to pay somebody. That happens, and when legal obligations happen are really important, because if I'm going to take funds from a particular fiscal year and I'm going to commit them to a project, I can't commit those funds, and let's assume that there are only annual fiscal year funds. I have to commit those funds and create a legal obligation before the end of the fiscal year, or I got to take them from another set of funds. And just like the situation involving the Commodity Credit Corporation, agencies very much toward the end of the fiscal year want to claim the open money that's still left in their appropriation for that particular fiscal year. So they're going to want to create that legal obligation in that fiscal year. That's not when the money goes out the door. That's the expenditure. The expenditure can happen later, but the obligation has to happen in the fiscal year in which the money is reserved so that it can be set aside for future outlay. That's a very legally specific process. You have to have a sum certain, and you have to have a legal obligation that doesn't reserve any rights for the federal government to take it away. Do you begin to see where we might have an issue here? Because and this has happened. I've been involved in cases where the agency brought to me a deal that they were trying to do literally on the 20th of September. And they said, you know, we've agreed to the loan. We know what the terms are going to be. We know what the project's going to be. We're just going to set the interest rate, you know, in a couple of weeks because it takes us a while to get that done because our computer system's really slow. And I said, you can't obligate the funds because you hadn't set the interest rate, which means you don't have a sum certain. Sum certain doesn't mean an actual dollar amount. It must mean a framework or a formula. Well, if the administration is going to take the position that at any time they can change policy and therefore terminate a grant, I wonder if they have legal obligations. And if they have obligated funds in a manner that is not consistent with the obligation rules, have we violated the Anti-Deficiency Act?
And so for me, I have to say, I have grants that are obligated. You know, it says on it that these are appropriated and obligated funds. And where I'm stuck is we have submitted these reimbursement requests. These are obligated, as far as I know, that the government is going to honor that obligation. But what happens when there's nobody behind the desk or when they're pushing it further and further down? What are we supposed to do? We don't have the legal capacity to fight those fights, you know, that you were outlining. We can't fight like that. I mean, maybe if we, you know, collectively organize, but, you know, farmers don't really have a lot of spare time, so.
No, I mean, that's the struggle. And that's the difficulty that we're in right now. And all I can lay out is what I'm seeing in the case law. And it's still not completely settled because you've got, and again, there's a whole set of these that are also cooperative agreements, which are neither contract nor grant. And what a cooperative agreement is, it's agreement where both parties agree to put something into the pot, whether it's money on the one side from the government or in-kind services or other kinds of contributions on the other side. And the question's going to be, right now, it's all kind of a muddle where they're all kind of being pulled together when in fact legally they are three distinct structures and they have different ways of dealing with them, and some of them have an administrative piece that goes in front of it before you can even go to court. If you're talking about an APA challenge in a farm program case, you're talking about going to something called the National Appeals Division before you can even go to court. And so, to get to your point, the legal road on some of these is challenging and long. And I'm not advocating or supporting it. That's the legal landscape we find ourselves in today. And that's why, in some cases, one of the cases that's moving forward on the cooperative agreements front is actually being taken up by the states. Because, you know, for dealing with a program like CREP, it's actually a program with the state. And so at least the state can have the muscle to try to at least challenge these and hopefully get some case law that can start being applicable not just to the states, but also to individual grantees. I mean, I think that's the best hope is that there can be some clarity in that context.
And just to wrap, like for me, these projects are all awarded because they are for a bigger cause than just my farm. They are for the public interest. So these are all projects that, don't necessarily directly benefit my bottom line as a farm business. So we're incurring ongoing expenses for these projects that are for the greater good, and that's part of why I'm passionate about what I do, is because it's cool. We can have a really big impact if we collaborate with these organizations for the public interest. But it becomes really hard when they start being unreliable. Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, you're just holding the mic?
I'm
Does
just
anyone else
holding the
have a
mic.
question?
We're out of time for questions.
Oh, okay, never mind.
So join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you for that last session. We are going to go into our closing remarks, but before that, I want to remind you all that an evaluation will be sent to the email that you used to register for the conference, so stay tuned for that email for the evaluation. Our closing remarks, I'd like to introduce Darren Jarbo as Principal Agent and Assistant Director, University of Maryland Extension, Agriculture and Food Systems. Here's Darren.
Thank you, Kristen. Good afternoon. We had a lot of excellent speakers today. I think that the program touched on a lot of things that are current and very timely. The power needs in the state, heat stress rules, local food security, agricultural law, economic incentives for riparian buffers, and federal budgeting rules, covering a wide range of topics. I'd like to give the speakers another round of applause for the great job they did today. ALEI actually is a fairly large organization. Our 3 universities have a significant commitment to this program, and I'd like to recognize the people who are involved in the program. You heard about the working group. They're the ones who put the conference together, did the heavy lifting. So if we could have Paul, Kristen, Megan, Sam, and Nicole stand up. That's the working group. Those are legal specialists. Then we have the executive committee, and you met Dean Laurent earlier. Dean Moses Cairo is usually here. I believe he's probably at the APLU meeting in Philadelphia today. That's the same place where our new dean, Dean Wendy Powers, is located, or is today as well. They make up our executive team, and they look at really the strategic perspective, and they support the program overall. We have an advisory panel. It's a wide-ranging group of folks that give us Maryland's perspective on what we're doing. What should we be doing in ag education, or in ag law education, I should say. Are any of them in the room today? If they are, would you please stand up and be recognized? There were a couple here earlier today. Also, one person who makes a big difference to us by providing information, mentoring, that type of thing is Adrienne Arthur with Empower, and she's here today back in the room there. Putting on this type of program and coordination between institutions is really actually kind of difficult, and she helps with that aspect of it. And then there's the ALEI Leadership Committee. That includes Deb Eisenberg and Nelson Escobar. Deb's at UMB, and Nelson is at UMES. I'm also on that committee and represent UMD. Right now, the agricultural community, as we heard most of today, is caught up in a lot of change. The part that I deal with in Extension, we're looking at spiraling costs, market turmoil, and adoption of new technologies that are really creating issues for producers. And we're especially seeing that right now in our grain production area, where they're dealing with spiraling costs, as I said, but also low prices. The other sectors, as you heard Emma and Carl talk about, are also dealing with a lot of issues. I think it's important that the conference examine some of these challenges that are faced by our food and ag system, as well as the environmental impacts in our community. I do believe that the innovations, the knowledge creation, and financial resources that some of the speakers talked about, if not all of the speakers, talked about today, are important for us moving forward. Some of the recent policy changes, as just in the last panel talked about, has greatly affected our innovation engine for the country. And that innovation engine is where we get our solutions. Right now, ALAI does enable farmers, agribusinesses, and communities to adjust to some of these different situations, and we'll continue to work on that. It will probably require the pursuit of new opportunities, which is pretty much par for the course in general as society moves forward. The expansion of local food systems is one of the new areas, or areas, actually it's a revisit of an area, because Maryland used to be very much in that production area. The reason I think that's a great example to look at is that we have Maryland General Assembly members interested in that area, as well as many agricultural stakeholders. And as Secretary Addix talked about, addressing the food system security and resiliency deficiencies that we saw during COVID. Some of the incentive programs that were outlined I think are going to be important in this space. In particular, the LEAF program that Secretary Addix outlined. It rewards farmers for high quality production, conserving resources, and really saving the environment and working to protect the bay. You note that when they put this program together over the last few years, that they were out and they visited with Marylanders as they were putting the program together to get their opinions on that. And they were very diligent about that. And so I think that will make it such that it is a strong program for our state. I think concentrated food production is something that we're going to have to think about, and it's not really something we have been doing except in one major industry in the state. But our lead Maryland Class 11 went on their international experience, and during that experience they went to Spain and saw large greenhouse growing areas. So there were acres and acres of greenhouses is really what it got down to. Last month, I took a high-speed train from Beijing to Nanjing, China, and that passes right through Shandong Province, which is one of their large fruit and vegetable production areas. And right next to the railway, which is all I saw, were square miles of hoop structures and other controlled environment agriculture systems. And it made me think that Maryland has a lot of things similar to that, because what they have is they have a bunch of big cities located nearby, so a large population. We have that here as well. So are there some things that we can learn from their business and production models that we can bring to Maryland and move our system ahead faster and speed things up? Shouldn't forget ALEI's role in this. Because there'll be regulatory frameworks that go with this, there'll be legal education that's needed, and we'll be there to help with that. ALEI has served traditional agriculture, and we have worked on new innovations, and that was talked about today. So the artificial intelligence and the electricity that drives artificial intelligence. Precision agriculture, unique strategies for managing production issues, as well as other innovations. Our main goal with ALEI is to improve producer profitability, help them conserve resources, and protect the environment. I want to highlight a few of ALEI's important work this past year. The team continued to educate students, providing internships and involving both undergraduate and graduate students in ALEI faculty research projects. ALEI partnered with West Virginia University, Penn State University, Virginia Tech University, and Ohio State University to organize a successful conference for nearly 60 attorneys in the region up at the National Conservation Training Center in West Virginia. ALEI continues to play a lead role in the USDA Northeast 2203 multi-state research project, the only agriculture and resource law multi-state project in the National Experiment Station system. Workshops were hosted this winter that focused on H2A labor and farm succession. We had 10 in-person heirs property workshops, and we had 1 online webinar series for heirs property. A few of the ALEI honors and recognitions this past year include the Owning Farmland Ag Law online course won the 2025 Outstanding Project Award from the USDA Northeast Risk Management Center. Nicole Cook continues to serve as co-chair of the American Bar Association's Food, Agriculture, and Cannabis Committee in the International Law section. Megan Todd was appointed to the Governor's Intergovernmental Commission on Agriculture in Maryland, and Paul Geringer was elected to a 3-year term on the board of the International Farm Transition Network. The network will host the association's annual conference in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania this year. As we close, I'd like you to think about the areas that ALEI needs to explore in the future, whether it be for our educational programming or our research, our applied research programs. As Kristen said, we have a meeting evaluation. That's where I'd like to see you put that in if you have ideas. We do review those and use those to determine the topics for future conferences, as well as our research projects. Thank you for being here today. You've made it a great conference. Have a safe trip home.